Hello, everyone. This week we're going to be talking about the conflict between Israel and Palestine. So what I would like you to do is click on this video link and watch the video. It does a really great job of explaining the conflict and showing you some really good visuals of what's going on. This below is the transcript of the video, and then there's questions along the side. I'm going to read this and explain it to you. I really want you to also watch the video because it's very informational. So, growing nationalism in Israel Palestine. One of the biggest myths about the Israel Palestine conflict is that it's been going on for centuries and that this is all about ancient religious hatreds. In fact, while religion is involved, the conflict is mostly about two groups of people who claim the same land. It really only goes back about a century to the early 1900s. Around then, the region along the eastern Mediterranean, we now call Israel Palestine, had been under Ottoman rule for centuries. It was religiously diverse, including mostly Muslims and Christians, but also a small number of Jews who lived generally in peace. And it was changing in two important ways. First, more people in the region were developing a sense of being not just ethnic Arabs, but Palestinians, a distinct national identity. At the same time, not so far away in Europe, more Jews were joining a movement called Zionism, which is one of your vocabulary terms, which said that Judaism was not just a religion, but a nationality, one that deserved a nation of its own. So Zionism is a form of Jewish nationalism and that belief that Jews should have their own homeland. And they saw their historic homeland in the Middle East as their best hope for establishing it. In the first decades of the 20th century, tens of thousands of European Jews moved there. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and the British and French empires carved up the Middle East, with the British taking control of a region called the British Mandate for Palestine. At first, the British allowed Jewish immigration, but as more Jews arrived, settling into farming communes, tensions between Jews and Arabs grew. Both sides committed acts of violence. By the 1930s, the British began limiting Jewish immigration. In response, Jewish militias formed to fight both the local Arabs and to resist British rule. So what that part about the British Mandate, what that doesn't include is the Balfour Declaration. So it's in 1917 that Lord Balfour writes a declaration that says that Palestine should be a homeland for the Jews. That's why there's a lot of Jewish migration during this time. It doesn't mention that in this video, but that's the Jews don't just randomly go there. They go there because the British tell them, yeah, you should go there. That should be your homeland. The Partition Plan in 1948 Arab-Israeli War. So after the Balfour Declaration and the British Mandate, then we have World War II and the Holocaust. So then came the Holocaust, leading many more Jews to flee Europe for British Palestine and galvanizing much of the world in support of the Jewish state. In 1947, a sectarian violence between Arabs and Jews grew. The United Nations approved a plan to divide British Palestine into two separate states, one for Jews, Israel, and one for Arabs, Palestine. The city of Jerusalem, where Jews, Muslims, and Christians all have holy sites, was to become a special international zone. So that's what this map is showing you right here. This is the UN Partition Plan in 1947. So the gold areas represent what would be the Arab state of Palestine. And then these blue areas would be Israel. This white spot right here, that's Jerusalem, and they're saying that's an international zone. So that would be kind of protected by the United Nations. It wouldn't necessarily be part of Palestine or part of Israel. The plan was meant to give Jews a state, to establish Palestinian independence, and to end the sectarian violence that the British could no longer control. The Jews accepted the plan and declared independence as Israel, but Arabs throughout the region saw the UN plan as just more European colonialism trying to steal their land. So the Jews at this point are satisfied with this plan because at least now they have a homeland, whereas before they didn't. The Arabs, though, they're not happy with this because all this blue that the UN is deciding to give to the Jews used to be their land. So the Arabs see it in a completely different way. They want all of this to be Palestine because that's what it was before, and now they're trying to take some of their land and give it to the Jews. So it doesn't have that much to do with religion as much as it has to do with nationalism and each of these groups wanting their own nation, but they want their own nation on the same land. Many of the Arab states who had just recently won independence themselves declared war on Israel in an effort to establish a unified Arab Palestine where all of the British Palestine had been. The new state of Israel won the war, but in the process, they pushed well past their borders under the UN plan, taking the western half of Jerusalem and much of the land that was to have been part of Palestine. They also expelled huge numbers of Palestinians from their homes, creating a massive refugee population whose descendants today number about 7 million. At the end of the war, Israel controlled all of the territory except for Gaza, which Egypt controlled, and the West Bank, named because it's west of the Jordan River, which Jordan controlled. This was the beginning of the decades-long Arab-Israeli conflict. During this period, many Jews in Arab-majority communities fled or were expelled, arriving in Israel. So after this plan gets put into place, the Arabs attack Israel. They declare war. Israel wins and then ends up expanding Israel into what would have been the Arab state. Then something happened that transformed the conflict. In 1967, Israel and the neighboring Arab states fought another war. When it ended, Israel had seized the Golan Heights from Syria, which is up here, this tan region, the West Bank from Jordan, which is this area right here, and both the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. Israel was now occupying the Palestinian territories, including all of Jerusalem and its holy sites. This left Israel responsible for governing the Palestinians, a people it had fought for decades. So Israel is a very powerful military. These surrounding countries declare war on Israel, thinking, well, we'll all attack Israel and they'll lose. But what happens is Israel wins and then gains all this territory. So now there's another problem because Israel has claimed all the territory that was supposed to be Palestine. Camp David Accords. In 1978, Israel and Egypt signed the U.S. brokered Camp David Accords, and shortly after, Israel gave Sinai back to Egypt as part of a peace treaty. At the time, this was hugely controversial in the Arab world. Egypt President Anwar Sadat was assassinated in part because of outrage against it, but it marked the beginning of the end of the wider Arab-Israeli conflict. Over the next few decades, the Arab states gradually made peace with Israel, even if they never signed formal peace treaties. But Israel's military was still occupying the Palestinian territories of the West Bank and Gaza, and this was when the struggle became an Israeli-Palestinian struggle. So up until this point, it's an Arab-Israeli struggle because these Arab countries that surround Israel were attacking it. Once these countries, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, once they, they don't sign treaties, but once they become more friendly with Israel, it becomes a Palestinian-Israeli conflict because now it's just in Israel and how they're dealing with the Palestinians that live there. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, which had formed in the 1960s to seek a Palestinian state, fought against Israel, including through acts of terrorism. Initially, the PLO claimed all of what had been British Palestine, meaning it wanted to end the state of Israel entirely. Fighting between Israel and the PLO went on for years, even including a 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon to kick the group out of Beirut. The PLO later said it would accept dividing the land between Israel and Palestine, but the conflict continued. Israeli settlements. As all of this was happening, something dramatic was changing in the Israeli-occupied Palestinian territories. Israelis were moving in. These peoples are called settlers, and they made their land in the West Bank and Gaza, whether Palestinians wanted them or not. Some moved for religious reasons, some because they want to claim land for Israel, and some just because housing is cheap and often subsidized by the Israeli government. Some settlements are cities with thousands of people. Others are small communities deep into the West Bank. The settlers are followed by soldiers to guard them, and the growing settlements force Palestinians off their land and divide the communities. So Israel occupies the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, even though those are supposed to be part of Palestine. So even if we were just to go back and say, okay, let's look at the UN plan again and go back to that, what this part of the article is saying is that Israelis have moved in here. So you can't just like go back to the way it was unless you're going to kick some Israelis out of this territory and force them to go back over here. So short term, they make the occupation much more painful for Palestinians. Long term, by dividing up Palestinian land, they make it much more difficult for the Palestinians to ever have an independent state. Today, there are several 100,000 settlers in occupied territory, even though the international community considers them illegal. The first Intifada. By the late 1980s, Palestinian frustration exploded into the Intifada, which is the Arab word for uprising. It began with mostly protests and boycotts, but soon became violent, and Israel responded with heavy force. A couple hundred Israelis and over 1,000 Palestinians died in the first Intifada. The Oslo Accords. Around the same time, a group of Palestinians in Gaza who considered the PLO too secular and too compromise-minded created Hamas, a violent extremist group dedicated to Israel's destruction. By the early 1990s, it was clear that Israelis and Palestinians had to make peace, and leaders from both sides signed the Oslo Accords. This is meant to be the big first step towards Israel maybe someday withdrawing from the Palestinian territories and allowing an independent Palestine. The Oslo Accords established the Palestinian Authority, allowing Palestinians a little bit of freedom to govern themselves in certain areas. Hardliners on both sides opposed the Oslo Accords. Members of Hamas launched suicide bombings to try to sabotage the process. The Israeli right protested peace talks, with ralliers calling Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin a traitor and a Nazi. Not long after Rabin signs the second round of Oslo Accords, a far-right Israeli shoots him to death in Tel Aviv. This violence showed how the extremists on both sides can use violence to derail peace and keep a permanent conflict going as they seek the other side's total destruction. That's the dynamic that's been around ever since. Negotiations meant to hammer out the final details on peace drag on for years, and a big Camp David summit in 2000 comes up empty. The second Intifada. Palestinians come to believe that peace isn't coming and rise up in a second Intifada. This one much more violent than the first. By the time it wound down a few years later, about 1,000 Israelis and 3,200 Palestinians had died. The second Intifada really changes the conflict. Israelis become much more skeptical that Palestinians will ever accept peace and that it's even worth trying. Israeli politics shift to the right, and the country builds walls and checkpoints to control Palestinian movements. They're not really trying to solve the conflict anymore, they're just managing it. The Palestinians are left feeling like negotiating didn't work and violence didn't work, and they're stuck under an ever-growing occupation with no future as a people. That year, Israel withdraws from Gaza. Hamas gains power but splits from the Palestinian Authority in a short civil war, dividing Gaza from the West Bank. Israel puts Gaza under a suffocating blockade, and unemployment rises to 40%. So what this last part is talking about is how both sides have tried to come to peace, but the extremist groups on both sides want just the other side to be destroyed. So no peace agreement would ever satisfy them because they don't want Israel to exist. And Israel doesn't want Palestine to exist. that's not everyone, that's just the extremists on both sides. So Hamas doesn't want Israel to exist. So when Israel withdraws from Gaza, Hamas takes over Gaza, and because they're an extremist group, Israel has them creates a blockade around them so that they're going to suffer until they change their attitude. So answer these 13 questions about that video. Please watch the video. There's important people in the video that you need to see. And they will show you video of like all these walls and checkpoints that they're talking about in the article. And then I would like you to watch this crash course video on the conflict and then record 3 facts.